believe in a world outside my own mind. I have to believe that my actions still have meaning, even if I can't remember them. I have to believe that when my eyes are closed, the world's still there.
There is a difference between the wisdom that comes from the body, a wisdom that comes from the intuition, and a bunch of stuff that happens in our heads. Helping people to actually feel into their bodies and to come from that deeper place is a big deal, and it's a big part of what I find myself, helping people to do.
Do I believe the world's still there? Yeah. We all need mirrors to remind ourselves who we are.
This is your nautical lantern on the dangerous seas of darkness. Let's push off from the placid shore of the status quo and explore what's beyond the horizon. I am your host, BT, and this is Truth and Shadow, your podcast of the supernatural. To be human is to seek wholeness, a state of being where all aspects of life harmonize, creating a sense of fulfillment and purpose. This journey towards wholeness is not merely about physical health or intellectual achievement, but about the deep integration of the mind, body, and spirit. When we ignore one dimension, we risk imbalance, dissatisfaction, and a fragmented sense of self. From, say, a Jungian perspective, achieving wholeness involves individuation, the process by which a person integrates various parts of their psyche, including the conscious, unconscious, and spiritual elements of their being. Carl Jung argued that without this integration, a person remains divided within themselves, suffering from an inner disharmony that can manifest in psychological distress, existential anxiety, or a pervasive sense of meaninglessness. In the same sense, Pope Benedict XVI emphasized that the human person is not merely a biological entity, but a spiritual being with a deep yearning for truth, beauty, and communion with God. He viewed the neglect of the spiritual dimension as one of the greatest crises of modernity, leading to a loss of identity and the erosion of moral and social cohesion. By exploring these perspectives, we can better understand why a holistic approach to life, one that nurtures the intellect, tends to the body, and satisfies the soul, is not just desirable, but necessary for true being. Carl Jung's concept of individuation is central to understanding why a holistic life is vital. It's the process of becoming one's true self by integrating various aspects of the psyche, like the ego, the persona, the shadow, the anima, animus, and the self. Jung believed that failing to integrate these aspects leads to psychological distress. When we suppress our shadow, we project it onto others, resulting in blame, hostility, or an inability to take responsibility for our own weaknesses. When we are too attached to our persona, we become superficial, enslaved to societal expectations rather than true to our deeper selves. Without the integration of the anima or animus, we struggle with relationships, failing to fully engage with our own emotional depth. Importantly, Jung recognized the spiritual aspect of this process. He saw religious experience as a crucial part of individuation, a means by which the individual connects with the transcendent and finds a greater sense of meaning. His exploration of archetypes, myth, and symbols suggested that spirituality is not an optional aspect of life, but a deep psychological necessity. When ignored, individuals feel lost, disconnected, spiritually impoverished. So they seek fulfillment in materialism or empty distractions, engage in compulsive behaviors. Jung had also warned against a one-sided development. A person who only focused on intellectual growth but neglects their emotional or spiritual life will always struggle with imbalance. Likewise, a purely physical existence, centered only on the pleasures or survival, always lacks depth and purpose. True psychological health comes from integrating all dimensions of ourselves into a cohesive whole. For Jung, wholeness is not about perfection, but about acceptance, embracing all aspects of the self, both the light and the dark, in order to live authentically. This requires self-examination, honest engagement with one's unconscious mind, and a willingness to confront one's fears and limitations. In doing so, a person moves forward toward a state of inner harmony, where spiritual and psychological needs are met in concert. Pope Benedict XVI approached the question of wholeness from a theological and philosophical perspective, emphasizing that human beings are created for communion with God. In his writings, he frequently warned against the fragmentation of modern life, where faith is often separated from reason and material concerns overshadow spiritual ones. For Benedict, true fulfillment cannot be found solely in intellectual achievement, economic success, or even psychological balance. These things, while important, do not address the deepest longing of the human heart, the desire for God, for a truth that is not of our own making, but given to us by God. He was particularly concerned with the consequences of a society that neglects spirituality. Without connection to the divine, he argued, people lose their sense of purpose and their moral direction. They become vulnerable to relativism, the belief that truth is subjective, shaped only by personal opinion and social trends. This, he believed, leads to a culture of confusion, where individuals struggle to discern right from wrong and where the pursuit of pleasure or power replaces the pursuit of goodness and virtue. Benedict XVI also spoke of the dangers of secularism, which he saw as an ideology that attempts to remove spirituality from public life. While he recognized the legitimacy of a pluralistic society, he insisted that faith and reason are not opposed but complementary. When faith is ignored, reason itself becomes distorted, leading to a world that values technological progress while neglecting moral wisdom. For Benedict, the holistic person is one who integrates faith with reason, body with soul, and action with contemplation. This integration is not about retreating from the world, but engaging with it more fully, rooted in a deep spiritual foundation. A person who nurtures their faith does not withdraw from life's challenges, but approaches them with clarity, courage, drawing from them a wellspring of divine wisdom. One of Benedict's key ideas was that love and truth are inseparable. In his encyclical Caritas in Veritate, Charity and Truth, he argued that the authentic love requires commitment to truth, just as true wisdom is inseparable from love. To live holistically is to embrace both, to seek truth while acting in love, to cultivate the intellect while nurturing the spirit, and to engage with the world while remaining anchored in the eternal. Therefore, to live holistically is to embrace the full spectrum of human experience, intellectual, emotional, physical, and spiritual. Jung taught us that true psychological health comes from integrating the many parts of ourselves. Benedict XVI reminded us that faith is essential for a life of purpose and meaning. In a world that often pulls us towards fragmentation, wholeness is an act of resistance. It is a commitment to living deeply, embracing all dimensions of life, and seeking not just personal fulfillment, but harmony with God, with others, and with ourselves. Have you ever felt a force moving within you that defies logic? A stirring that suggests there is more to our existence than meets the eye? Imagine glimpsing into the unseen, where healing isn't just the body, but of the spirit, where each awakening is a chapter in a grander mystery. What if the path to understanding these hidden realms was not guided by conventional wisdom, but by those who walk the thin line between our world and the other? Today, we'll delve into the experience of one who has navigated these currents, shedding light on energy, transformation, and the sacred, talking about unseen forces that touch our lives. She is the mystic healer, the veil piercer, and the seeker beyond. Welcome, Mary, to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I found you by happenstance. I'm a follower of another author from a publisher, and your titles of your books were recommended in my Amazon, and I said, oh, these look really interesting. Let me reach out and see if Mary would like to come on the show and talk about these with me, because it's stuff that I'm interested in looking into. But for those who have not heard of you, could you introduce yourself?
My name is Mary Schutan, or Mary Mueller Schutan on my books. I write a lot about the nature of consciousness, so my best known books are about spiritual awakening, but I have also been a teacher and practitioner for about 2 decades now of spiritual healing, energy work, and all sorts of different kinds of body work, including craniosacral therapy, as well as I have a master's degree in Chinese medicine, which is basically acupuncture and herbology.
Yeah, that's quite a list of experiences. And when we look at older forms of healing, Reiki, acupuncture, and we compare it to our modern everyday lives, I wonder if there is something that impacts our modern lifestyle with these traditional therapies. Do you find that to be so?
I do, yeah. Typically what happens in our world is that a lot of times new thoughts in, for example, psychology or kind of associated realms like that, like self-help, come about, and what they really are is a sort of retread or an understanding of, deeper, what might be termed shamanic or energy work principles. They've just been sort of gussied up a bit with modern psychological terms or modern considerations of the body.
Yeah, absolutely. And then within our day-to-day lived experience and the technology that we are swamped with, how can we protect our energy in those environments that feel, well, lack of a better word, hostile or draining?
It is a big problem these days. We are so connected via technology. It's great to be able to do things like this via video, but there's also, from a spiritual perspective, an epidemic of loneliness, an epidemic of isolation, disconnection that is happening on multiple levels. And the best solution for that is always a really simple one, which is connection. Going into kind of some of the basic principles of spiritual work, that is what I consider every day with my clients and every day for myself. On what level is there connection? On what level is there disconnection? And that can be connection to self, connection to other people, connection to the world, connection to spirit or the divine, to the earth. And if we look at where somebody is connected or disconnected, you can tell a lot about their spiritual health, as well as oftentimes their emotional and physical health as well.
You mentioned shaman, and I'm a fan of Carl Jung, so
Carl Jung would saw shamanism as this deep engagement with the unconscious mind, right? Practice where, the shaman, the shaman archetype can be a person or can be an experience, but it's like this mediator between the conscious world and these hidden realms. And it sounds like some of the stuff that you work with clients is aimed at that.
It is. There's definitely, sometimes people treat psychology and things like energy work or spirituality as completely separate realms, like they're at odds with one another. But if you start going into things like, depth psychology and that sort of stuff, it is describing pretty much the same experience just through a different lens. For example, my latest book is on shadow work. And so that is actually a very, spiritual concept. It has roots in tantric thought, very much in spiritual thought as well. But in terms of, if we were going to define kind of shamanic work, because it is sort of a tricky definition in some ways, my definition for it and how I practice is all about that connection. It is ensuring that I have a flow of energy within myself, but also connecting to and working with things like the elements, water, fire, earth, air, connecting to the divine, the stars, and in certain cases, connecting with, different spirits or energies, kind of depending on what I'm doing or who I'm working with. And so it has always been my claim or my goal to work both myself as well as, the students and clients that I have, and introduce them to the fact that spiritual connection can be with the tree in their front yard. It doesn't need to be in some other culture. It doesn't need to be in some other country.
No, I like that. Yeah, the idea of shadow work, that's really interesting to me. I've been reading up on this idea of shadow work and dealing with that part of the person. And it sounds like the methods that are being used by yourself is like what does Jung call it? Is it the wounded healer or the wise, the wise? Basically, it's the person who is a foundational, like a lightning rod. And they're the ones that are able to collect and harness some of this energy to help another person suffering from the dark night of the soul and help them address their own shadow work. Does that sound about right?
It is. That's a good way of looking at it. A big part of shadow work and shamanic work is that typically somebody who is called to be a spiritual healer or goes and engages with this work in depth, does their own work, has their own experiences, and goes through many initiations physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And so when they engage with people, it is from that place of knowing. They know what it's like to experience, a certain imbalance in their system because they have experienced that themselves. And, I've experienced that myself and gone through that process. So in some ways, it very much is a wounded healer process, but in the modern world, we tend to think of the wounded healer as somebody who suffers from one particular malady, and in that way, they can become more compassionate or help others with it. But if we are talking about spiritual work and spiritual initiations in particular, you can go through all sorts of strange physical, emotional, spiritual breakdowns or experiences that bring you into that place of knowing how to heal something and kind of give you a sense of empathy and connection to that to help others.
That's what I was thinking about. I think the other side of the coin was the wise elder. And I think that's the two sides that Jung talks about within that particular archetype. And I find it interesting that we have individuals who, like you said, they could go through something like, usually somebody who's suffered and recovered from, say, alcoholism is usually better equipped to help others out of that addiction than somebody who isn't. I mean, there's an experiential knowledge, an idea inside their minds that seems to be tuned to helping people through a trauma, if that makes sense.
It does. It makes perfect sense. And that's a great example, is that so many really helpful drug counselors, alcohol counselors come from a place of going through programs, going through their own addiction themselves. And so they can know intimately what the other person is experiencing, as well as, how to sort of guide them through the maze of a very thorny, complex situation.
And this involves individuals understanding how to be intentional, right? People who want to get better have to want to get better. And so there's an intentionality, and I'm wondering how important is that in healing in this aspect?
It is incredibly important. However, what I will say is that when people come to me, I assume at least a part of them is ready to engage with some sort of healing process, because otherwise they wouldn't have contacted me or booked an appointment. That being said, one person may come to me and they have a huge amount of resistance or a huge amount of wounding that really prevents them from doing much in a session. But that same person, in coming to somebody that can see that and recognize that and isn't coming from a place of judging them or trying to force them out of that resistance, that is going to be immensely healing for them, because that person may have experienced all sorts of judgment or problem with past authority figures or mistrust of humans or whatever is going on with them. And so it is very true that one person may come to me ready to take kind of like a little baby step, and some people come to me and it's like, let's heal your entire ancestral lineage, sort of session.
In the one session.
Yeah, basically. And those sessions can be wonderful and intense and all of that sort of stuff. And there's a lot of area in between, but a lot of it really has to do with personal readiness. A lot of it also has to do with the sort of time and space they have in their lives, honestly, to be able to integrate it, to be able to sort of mull over what happened, to process it on multiple levels, and to come out of it in some way anew.
In that work, there's the need to integrate, right? To make that trauma or that darker, that shadow part of ourselves integrated, right? I mean, if we don't address that aspect of ourselves, we will find ourselves in these moments where we're in this fight or flight, and it's not like just instinct. It's like our trauma-based past is setting us up in a specific way to respond to situations, right? Like if we had a trauma-based, when we were children, where we found ourselves having to defend our actions, innocent though they were, against an oppressive parental figure, we may find ourselves doing that as adults, right? Having to explain that, and asking this because I'm curious, how important is it for a person to integrate that shadow into themselves so that they are no longer reacting from that place, that shadow place?
It's really important. And so part of healing is definitely recognition. It's like, oh, I have anger and it is coming from, when I was 5 years old or something like that. And with spiritual work, you can actually go to that place with the person and help them through that, either give them resources that they didn't have at that age or energetically take them out of that situation. In more severe cases, what happens is that as we're going through development, basically as we're growing up, parts of our energy can get basically stuck, sort of frozen at particular ages. And so part of what happens when we re-engage with that part that is sort of stuck in time is that processing or integrating that, all of the emotions and nervous system responses that the person could not experience at that age are going to come up. So, for example, if somebody at 5 years old couldn't get angry because getting angry meant that they were going to be punished by their parents, what will happen when they are energetically out of that environment, no longer stuck there, is that for a period of time, they might find themselves really angry or having memories or strange dreams or even physical sensations in their body because their body is processing that, it is digesting that, and that can take a bit of time. And so in my work, I am always very clear with people that what happens in the session is kind of midway. Like they're likely already processing things prior to the session. Like after booking, they're probably already thinking about it, preparing for it in some way. And then the work is completed in whatever time we have together. But after that, I tell people that, for the next 3 to 7 days, they may experience, particular symptoms because their body is still processing it, it's still digesting it and getting to the point where they can start to emerge from it. And depending on the healing, that can actually take much, much longer than those 7 days. But that tends to be kind of the acute time when people notice, like, oh, I felt really angry for some reason, or I was crying for some reason, or I kept on thinking about this one situation with my friend or my mother, or, kind of stuff like that.
No, yeah, I understand. There's a principle of using the opposite energy. If we're in a place where we are, I'll say, closed off, angry, and our reaction is antisocial, we could the mother, what's the type, the great mother, or something like that. You reach out for the opposite energy. That's I'm trying to get my brain back in the right catalog there. If you're in this place where it's antisocial and you're acting out in an aggressive format, you want to train your mind and your body to inject itself with the opposite energy, right? So with antisocial and aggression, you want to do maternal stuff. So nurturing and helping out, giving yourself some nurture energy, right? And helping that calm back down. I've heard that these things help with addressing somebody's shadow self. And with your work, is this something that you've actually, like, you've done that?
I have. My work is very individualized, though, and part of shadow work is actually becoming really comfortable with dark emotions and experiences. So if somebody comes to me and they're really depressed, I'm not going to be like, oh, here are all the reasons to be joyful. Like, let's bring some joy in. What, and this can vary based on the person, but what the shadow work response or what a shamanic response would be to sit with them in their isolation, sit with them in their anger. Can they get even angrier? What would happen if they were to express all of their anger, all of their disconnection? What would happen if they were able to, that inner child was able to say or express anything it wanted to? And a lot of times in this type of work, we bring resources in. So a lot of times it can be the adult self, or sometimes it can be other spirits or ancestors, or, somebody maybe they made a relationship with later that, like a friend or something they're friends with as an adult. But a lot of times my work is actually allowing for that part to fully express whatever it needs to, while having supportive energy around that is telling them that they are completely valid to feel whatever they are feeling.
The atmosphere is to give them the space needed to engage in that emotion, a boundary basically, right? Without restriction.
Without restriction. And also one of the things you learn in, kind of your first day of, like, if you were to take a psychology class, is that one of our primary needs is to be seen and heard. And so when somebody is willing to do that to a part of themselves that may feel invisible or wrong, or all these sorts of things that we as humans feel, is that there is an incredible amount of healing that happens in that.
And then one of the ways that you address that is you teach people how to communicate with their consciousness. Isn't that right?
I do. One of my books is called The Body Deva. It is what I base a lot of my work around. When I first started doing spiritual work, the kind of idea around spiritual work is that kind of, here is this authority figure that is going to tell you what your reality is, or tell you what you need to heal. And I found that that doesn't work in the modern world, because so many of us feel powerless, disempowered. So many of us feel all sorts of complex, things around the nature of power, the nature of putting ourselves out there in a way to receive support. And so by helping people access their own bodies, their own spirit, and, kind of being a guide, but really letting them and whatever is within them call the shots, that gets people to a much different place, and to do some really extraordinary work where they are very engaged in the process.
And I would assume it would be really important for someone to understand how to differentiate between these spiritual insights and, I guess, what would be disassociation?
Yeah. There is a difference between the wisdom that comes from the body, a wisdom that comes from the intuition, and a bunch of stuff that happens in our heads, basically. So helping people to actually feel into their bodies and to come from that deeper place is a big deal, and it's a big part of what I find myself, helping people to do.
Yeah, I asked that because it's easy to use. It's easy to use some spiritual practices as escapism.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just a thing. We can find ourselves deeper within whatever it is. If any kind of spiritual tradition, we can basically become disassociated with reality to the point where we've escaped. And I don't think that that's a healthy way to navigate our world and address. I mean, honestly, that would cause another wound in the shadow self, to be honest.
It does, and it is a huge problem. We can kind of neatly put it into the category of spiritual bypass, which is a term of, utilizing spirituality to look away from the life, look away from the body. And it's something a lot of people do, is sort of utilize spirituality to sort of perpetuate their wounding, and when somebody is willing to look towards their wounding instead, they will find themselves more connected. If we're just utilizing spirituality to disconnect, that disconnection isn't going to be healed. The person's, I will say, effective spiritual healing results in changes in beliefs in daily reality and daily life, and feelings of esteem about the self, perspective on reality. And if we are just sort of in that, kind of disconnected spirituality, we just kind of go deeper and deeper into it instead of healing anything.
Yeah, we say we just go down the rabbit hole. That's a pretty common phrase.
We go down a rabbit hole, and not a fun rabbit hole.
No, it's because we separate ourselves, we cut ourselves off from what is natural or in nature, I guess, so to speak. And I think that natural cycles play a deepening effect in our spiritual growth and our spiritual awareness. And what kinds of ways can we tell people nature helps, natural cycles help?
Well, first of all, there's, a feeling of connection and of being in the world that comes from being in nature. Nature is one of our most obvious gateways to the other. So any sort of spiritual contact, if we're looking for any sort of connection to spirit, nature provides an excellent gateway, an easy gateway to kind of gain that sort of connection. The other thing I would say on a deeper level is that so many of us carry this enormous fear of death that we've made completely shadow. And so a lot of our lives are sort of based in this fear and making shadow our lack of acceptance of death. And so nature shows us those cycles of death and rebirth in a way that if we can connect to them, it can really heal significant fear and anxiety that is within pretty much most modern humans.
A vast majority of people will experience death if they are in an environment where they work, say in a hospital or an old folks' home. But I don't think the vast majority of people are going to experience death in their day-to-day lived experience. I mean, it's not like the Middle Ages where things like the plague were commonplace, and you would have entire neighborhoods dropping left and right, and you had no escape from the reality of death, right? I mean, it was always around you, and I think that having a respect for the quality of life and then, of course, the quality of death would be important for a person. Yeah.
It is. It's considered one of those things that, if you're to look at paths such as meditation and stuff like that, is that it's frequently a topic of here is something really deep you need to heal, that you need to come into acceptance with. It's considered one of those, advanced things for people to really approach and sit with and be okay with. And it is incredibly transformative, because, again, just like you were saying, like, unless somebody works in a hospital or, has really engaged with death in some way, it becomes this huge shadow for us. And there's a reason why, there are so many horror movies out there, why there's so many true crime podcasts, why Dateline has 8,000 episodes. It's because we're trying to observe that shadow, but we're not yet ready to sort of, integrate it or make it a part of ourselves yet.
Yeah, and the fascination with it. Well, I find that something that's probably helpful to begin a process of self-healing would be grounding oneself. If we were to just give some people tools on how to ground oneself, simply, what would be the simplest ways you could think of?
I go over some of these in my books in more detail, like the Spiritual Awakening Guide, but there are a couple of enormously simple ways. The first is exercise. Doesn't need to be you running a marathon. It can just be, a walk through the block. That is incredibly grounding. Things like sitting and putting your hands in the dirt. That was one of the first shamanic ceremonies that I experienced, was just sitting and putting my hands in the dirt, and we graduated into like whispering and shouting into the dirt and stuff like that. But if you are open and receptive, if you are sitting on the earth, it will create an energetic connection, and even more so, like if you are actually like sort of interacting with the earth. There are also other energetic ways that I talk about in my books where you can, pretend you're a tree growing roots, or if you're in a seated position. A lot of people aren't ready to energetically ground from their feet because they're so far up in their heads, but you can start to ground from the pelvis. And from like a kind of a seated position instead, and do the same sort of thing where you're imagining at first, but then going into actually feeling the sensation of an energetic connection from, from your genitals into the earth.
Right. Yeah, that would be basically doing Kundalini work, kind of the starting of that. Yeah, I just think that, an individual who wants to feel in a safer place, right? The chaos, life is chaos. There's no getting around that fact. And every once in a while, we need to feel safe in our environment. And I often tell people that there's a reason why we want to hug another, a loved one. There's a reason why we want to hold our pet, a cat or dog. Another one that's really common is out here in the country, we ride horses, and sometimes we just want to go and hug on a horse. And it's the oddest thing, but there's medical evidence that shows that the magnetic field of our body, and this is really true with the horse, is that the horse's heartbeat has this aura that extends like an insane amount of distance from the horse. And once you're in it, your body begins this really weird process of calming down and becoming safe. And I use that as an example because I've lived that. My wife's lived that. We're not doing so well. Depression, maybe, it's wintertime, right? Depression is big time in the wintertime. We just want to go and hug the horse and just go bareback or something. And we're fixed, right? That grounding action has worked. We feel safe. And I'm intrigued by that intimacy with, like I started with with a hug, hugging a loved one. There's intimacy in that, and the same with the pet and the animals. And the truth is, it doesn't just reset ourselves. We can actually reset our animals too when they are in a place of being unsafe by simply hugging or holding.
Yeah, those are all really great examples. A lot of people talk about how, life-saving their pets are, or going out into nature and how healing it is, even concepts like we call forest bathing or earthing,
Yes.
Connecting in those sorts of ways. And it all shows at its heart that us going from a state of feeling disconnected to a state of connection is so wonderful for us on so many different levels. It lets us feel loved and worthwhile and, connected, and that very much lifts our spirits.
Yeah, I think that there's a need to set up healthy spiritual boundaries too, right? That we need to basically establish healthy perimeters. And I think that there's so many people out in the world who have divided their physical existence with their spiritual existence. And so as one may put up physical barriers, you're like, at 2:00, I put my phone down, or gosh, this person is toxic, I've blocked them on all the socials. But those are all physical things. What are some of the ways that we can set up healthy spiritual boundaries?
It kind of depends, because, that can be a really big topic.
Right.
In terms of setting up spiritual boundaries, what I share with people is that the spirit realms are a mirror of this realm.
Mm-hmm.
And so, for example, if they are interacting with spirits, to treat them just like you would with people. You wouldn't want a random person to show up in your bedroom at night. Same with a spirit of, even if it's a spirit of a dead neighbor, something like that. And so giving people the tools so they can, it really is a balance, because I want to offer people tools to definitely have boundaries. But so many people are so deeply afraid of any sort of spiritual or magical connection that they are creating all of these shields, all of these protections for themselves. And then they are wondering why they are so disconnected spiritually. And so looking at what is disconnecting the person, what sort of movies or religious, spiritual stuff, family stuff they've sort of taken on that has caused for them to be in so much fear of the non-physical, is typically more where I focus with people. That being said, to sort of answer your question, you can have solid boundaries, for example, with spirits, and say, for example, I see you, I notice you, get out of my space.
Right.
A lot of people truly want to help in a spiritual capacity, but one of the things that happens is just like you can't help every person that, every physically alive person that you see on the street. Like, you do not need to help every, if you are able to sense spirits, you do not need to help every spirit that comes to you. And so those are some kind of like the boundaries with spirits I talk about. And in terms of boundaries energetically, keeping yourself healthy, the best you can physically, emotionally, will do a lot for spiritual boundaries as well.
Yeah, there's this aspect, I think, of spiritual work that involves other people, right? If we were to look at the shadow work, if we were just to tie in something from earlier, where we talk about shadow and shadow trauma and the connections that we may have had that develop whatever this trauma was, there's these connections that we have with other people. And I mean, they could be spiritual, they could be emotional, they don't have, and even physical, really. But I think there's something to be said there about how we engage with our trauma if it's caused from an outside source. If that makes sense.
Kind of. What I would say from a shadow work perspective is that we do experience all of these sort of traumas, and they shift our perspective. We close down, we shut down parts of ourselves, and
right.
We then project those parts of ourselves onto other people. So a lot of what is going on in the world energetically and from a shadow perspective is like all of our disowned, unhealed stuff that we're just trying to kind of lob at other people, either
right.
people like we're in contact with, or celebrities, or politicians, and kind of bigger figures like that. So that's kind of if I were to help anybody to understand kind of what they can take away about how shadow work can help them, it is that we can see kind of our biggest wounds in other people because we've so shoved them away from our own consciousness.
Right.
And so that's why shadow work is such a direct path to healing, why it is difficult in some ways because you have to be super honest with yourself, but very, direct method of engaging with your own stuff that you've sort of shoved out of your own subconscious onto other people.
Yeah, I guess that could involve trying to deal with the collective consciousness, I guess. We may be impacted by thoughts that might not actually be our own, specifically within the view of a Jungian psychology, I guess. And how would we navigate? How would we navigate the difference between our inner voice and this chaos?
It's a good question. The best thing that we can do is that what would be called that individuation process, is to get to know ourselves separate from the conditioning we've received. And when we start to do that, a sort of natural separation or questioning occurs where we're like, well, I know what that celebrity thinks. I know what the school I grew up with thinks. I know what my family thinks. What do I actually think about this? And that is a big part of shadow work, and specifically doing, kind of what we might term as like communal shadow work, is that process of really discovering the self, discovering authenticity within the self, and sort of separating. In my book, I even talk about how, for example, obviously I'm an author, but if you go to Amazon or any review site for books or movies or anything like that, if you read them after you have watched a movie or read a book, it is likely going to change your opinion on what you thought about the book. And so this is one of the kind of sort of quote unquote easy tests that people can offer to themselves, of either, not engaging at all with that, reviews and that sort of stuff, or thinking about what you truly think about that book or movie or music or album or whatever. And then when you go to the reviews, not being swayed by them, not having your opinion changed by them.
Right.
Obviously, there's a bit of nuance there because sometimes people can make good points and that sort of stuff, but we are so easily swayed by what the collective thinks, what collective figures, politicians, celebrities, social media figures think. Even in this age, it used to be advertising celebrities, and now it's more like, how did that meme affect you? How did that social media personality, how did that reality star, how does that change, who we think as an individual we are. I think it's also interesting because if we are to talk about the difference between kind of psychology and going to a shamanic or spiritual level, on a shamanic or spiritual level, we would talk about sicknesses in the community, and how things like, I'll pick on some easy ones, greed, narcissism, stuff like that, can be communal sicknesses that then will be reflected in the individual. And so in shamanic work, it is never the fault of one individual for whatever physical, emotional, spiritual illness they're experiencing. There is always an aspect in which there is consideration about how that is reflected of family sickness, communal sickness, like world sickness, that sort of stuff, if that makes sense.
Yeah, we throw these words around like thinking, and we know that a vast majority of individuals do what's known as passive thinking, right? You say, hey, what do you think about the weather? And depending upon whether you like sweater weather or you like flip-flops and shorts, you're gonna say, well, it's cold outside and I don't like it, or it's raining and I hate it, and these are all real passive. And there's just a value to teach somebody or to learn how to do some deep critical thinking, and I think that's being drawn out when we are honest in our spiritual work, being able to address our thoughts. And like you were saying in the beginning, being able to say, hey, I know what my family thinks. I know what my tradition thinks. I know what school wants me to think. But what do I think? And I think that's the hardest thing to address, because once again, the vast majority is going to go back to these passive ideas and be influenced somewhere along the lines by, I don't know, some hero that they have. However they would have viewed something is how you may. And so it's like, you've got to create these people in your head and have a fight with them, right? You got to develop like a multi-personality thinking disorder and address your thoughts and attack and defend and find yourself. And I think there's a value in integrating this thought pattern into our lived experience that is missing.
It is, there is a process in energy work and spiritual experience that you can get to a place of directly knowing things,
right,
rather than relying on outer sources. But we also have to consider, where people are, is that, for example, a lot of people come to me and they want for me to be the type of person that tells them what their reality is. They do not want to critically think.
Right.
That is what they're looking for. And so for people willing to critically think, to kind of do the work, we have to recognize that that is a minority, unfortunately, because it does require effort. Is that effort worth it? Yes. Of course.
Definitely.
It definitely leads at least to a more interesting life, rather than just living out the same life that your parents did, or, whatever is going on. But there needs to be a willingness to engage and to consider all of these different beliefs and words and thoughts of others, in order to become kind of an original thinker or a critical thinker. We so tend to stay with thoughts that mimic the sort of conditioning we already have, rather than engaging with thoughts and with thinkers that think kind of outside of whatever box is we're in.
Series of boxes. There's the Russian dolls. I mean, this is a real thing. People live within boxes, within boxes, within boxes, and it takes a long time, as you would attest to in your own work experience, that you have to pull them out of each individual box along their journey, and it takes work.
It does. Some of the homework that I give to people, it sounds so funny, but it isn't going to that heavy place. It is I will give them homework to consider, as long as they don't have food issues in their past, like, do you like mustard? Right. What kind of mustard do you like? What kind of music do you like? Most of us listen to music that is from our youth, and, that's great, but
that is correct.
What sort of music would 30, 40, 50, 60-year-old you like now? Are you willing to listen to different kinds of music and be like, oh, I like that, or oh, I don't like that? And so there are all these different ways that aren't so like heavy, aren't so like, creating of existential crises. Like, we can literally be like, you know what? I had no idea what green goddess dressing was, but now I really like it. That's
sure
a level of things too.
Or we might not have ever had Grey Poupon as a kid, and now all of a sudden it's like, oh, this is actually really nice. And
yeah, exactly.
all of those things. Well, so we always every day we can have an opportunity to start on a spiritual path. And the question is how do we know what path we're being called on? What can we point to help us understand where our particular journey is leading us next?
It's a tricky question because we are inundated with so much information and so many paths out there. I will say that we can do a little experimenting and, read some books and really start to ask ourselves what resonates with us. And by that, I mean what interests us, but also what feels right to us. There can be a sense of palpable feeling of rightness in our bodies when we come across knowledge that resonates with us, that we like, that we're ready for. And so it is always a process of, kind of trying a few things out and seeing which thing really resonates with you, and sort of discarding things that don't feel right to you. And so that's generally kind of the best advice I can give to anyone, is actually read, of course, but do a bit of the work and see how your body responds, see what the effects of your life are, if you are on a right path, or you are on a path that at the very least will create some interesting stuff in your life, things will start to shift a bit, and that can be a good indicator.
Yeah, there's definitely something to be said about just letting ourselves be silently drawn to, or drawn by, I guess, the strange pull, right? If we have something that's kind of strange and it's pulling us, and we're not really sure what it is, but sometimes just letting that guide us a little bit can help. I don't know, read a book that we might not have ever read before. We might pick up something that is outside of our on our faith tradition that can actually strengthen the faith tradition that we have now.
Yeah, I will say, back in my day, it was a little bit easier. I had it's kind of a funny story. I don't know if I've ever shared this before, but I had a spiritual relationship with thrift stores. And so I'd go into thrift stores, and on their bookshelves would often be like some occult books and, or some magical books or some books about meditation. And I would be like, oh, and they'd be like, buy me. And, that's a lot of how as a teenager I started to become, interested in some of these topics. Today, these days, it can be somebody just keeping their ears open, and then, maybe they see a podcast about something, and then a friend mentions the same topic to them, and then somebody else, mentions something in a teacher in that area. And so all of those, if we keep our eyes and ears open, can kind of lead us to discovering some great books and great teachers and all that sort of great paths that are out there.
Yeah. Your story just reminds me when I was younger, one of and I still have this book, the Spiritual Teachings of Rumi. It's a poetry book, and I still turn to it, and it still gives me a little bit of, nuggets of gold, and they're there. Well, Mary, as we wrap up, I'd like to give you the opportunity to tell listeners where they could find more about you. You talk about offering counseling sessions, not just your books. I'll include your books in the show, links to your books in the show notes. But what I would like is, what's your mission statement when it comes to your counseling, and what's that about? And see if that's a tool that listeners may be interested in.
So people can find me at maryshutan.com. I do have the books that you mentioned. I also am a teacher, so people can check out my workshops. In terms of my individual appointments, at this time I focus on spiritual healing. So I work with people who are ready to, do a deep dive in themselves. I work with a lot of people who have experienced spiritual awakening or strange spiritual experiences to help them integrate them. But a lot of times my work with people is doing pretty intensive spiritual healing work with them, where we go into the body, where we get a sense of what their spiritual energetic imbalance is on whatever level it is, inner child, ancestral, past life, societal, all that sort of stuff. And then we work together to resolve it. I always make clear that my work is always non-forceful, and that it is really empowering for the person experiencing it, because they play a big role in the process.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for coming on my show and talking to me today. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening. This is a free podcast based upon the value for value model. If you find value in this or any episode, you can return that value by liking the show, subscribing to this channel, leaving a review, or sharing with a friend on your social media accounts. You can also donate on my website. Thank you again. This is BT for Truth in Shadow Podcast. You are the light in the darkness.